presentation is based on chapter 5.2 of the handbook, The European Experience, a multiple perspective history of modern Europe, 1500-2000. And we will structure the presentation as the chapter is structured. We will start by looking at the distribution of wealth in early modern history. Then we will look at trends, intellectual debates, and practical responses to the distribution of wealth and to inequality in modern history. And finally, we will look at these three aspects in contemporary history as well. So let's just jump right into it. Ideas and theories about wealth and its distribution in early modern history can be broadly divided into two phases, before and after the 1750s, using the first industrial revolution and the subsequent advent of capitalism, industrial work, and the development of global markets as a watershed between the two. The key word to describe wealth and its distribution before the 1750s is mercantilism, which was characterized around Europe by three main features: the monopolism of exports, control of exchanges, and the balance of trade, as highlighted by Joseph Schumpeter. By applying these three regulatory principles, the creation and distribution of wealth was restrained throughout Europe in the period between the 1500s and the mid-1700s. As a consequence, society remained headed by two categories of people: land-owning aristocracy and members of the church. During this period, most of the attempts to regulate wealth distribution focused on price control, so on the maintaining of a constant and hopefully affordable price for the first necessary needs, such as bread, barley, and the basic clothing and shelter, with no attempt to addressing inequality. Ideas on wealth and its distribution in this period were deeply intertwined with general ideas about the political and social orders. This can be summed up with the belief that a fair and just prince would ensure the redistribution of wealth to its less affluent subjects. In Spain, for example, diplomat Diego de Saavedra Fajardo advised princes not to give its powerful subjects what was owed to the poor. He used a very, very apt metaphor, and he invited the prince to be like the snow of the mountain that doesn't melt only onto big rivers that would go through the valley without nourishing it properly, but that, on the contrary, supplies water also to the smaller rivers and streams that would better benefit the valley. Lesser members of the nobility were also recommended to adhere to the same principles, so to distribute their wealth in a way that would benefit the texture of the community, and so not only to already rich or enriched people, but also to the poorer members of society. Other principles that governed the redistribution of wealth in the period were ecclesiastical charity, philanthropy, and the control of prices, together with taxes and inflation. With the advent of capitalism and industrial work after the 1750s, new political and economic theories came to the forefront, and a new approach to the markets blossomed, focused on deregulation. So if mercantilism was the keyword before the 1750s, we can say that deregulation is the keyword after the 1750s. This trend was based on the idea that governments should not intervene in markets and labor, because if barriers to wealth were removed, the market would then regulate itself, and inequalities in wealth and income will decrease naturally. The market just had to, the government just had to stay out of it, and the market would regulate itself. This, however, this deregulation, this laissez-faire, had the opposite result, determining a growing inequality in the distribution of wealth and income among different classes and members of society. Looking at the data that is available for the period between the 1450s and the 1800s, it's evident that inequality was on the rise across Europe. We can in particular identify three different practices of equality: of income, of wealth, and of rights. In terms of inequality of rights, we can in particularly notice inequalities in who had the right to own property or to hold a specific profession. The unequal distribution of rights had an impact on wealth and income subsequently. For example, many guilds upheld restrictions in terms of ancestry. Only children of members of the guild could engage in a particular craft, let's say in the production of furniture, thus limiting who could accumulate wealth with it. At the same time, it's also important to notice that guilds had a role in leveling wealth and income distribution within themselves, because they were implementing restrictions that would prevent the rising of inequalities within the guild. For example, by limiting the amount of tools that a workman could own or the amount of trips that a workman could take in a specific period of time. The unequal distribution of rights and its impact on wealth and income can be seen across Europe, but especially in cities and in urban areas. Here, inequality rose at a faster pace than in rural communities. And we need to keep in mind that the majority of European population in the period between the 1450s and the 1800s was living in rural communities. Why is this? Why did inequality rise at a slower pace in rural communities? Well, it's due to a series of factors that mitigated the rise of equality. These factors included the local regimes, customs, but also some forms of self-organization. Self-organization is a particularly interesting case because it could take both the shape of protests or contestations. For example, if a ruler tried to impose new prices, but also of community-based taxation, which was often focused on taxing the wealthier households and thus working as a means of redistribution in its own. At the end of the Middle Ages, in several parts of Europe, we can assist to a sort of tensions between mercantilist societies, where the rich were determining the distribution of wealth, and non-elites who, through rebellion, had been able to secure some rights and agency on the local distribution of wealth. Throughout the early modern period, the members of these known elites saw their position threatened by the increasingly rich merchants on the one hand, and by landowners on the other. In addition, the solidarity that had determined the self-organization and the rebellions was also under strain due to the very nature of the changes in distribution of wealth that it brought about. For example, in England in the early 16th century, due to the increasing population and inflation, the landowners tried to increase the costs for renting their land. This attempt was met with protests from the peasants, culminating in revolts such as the Western Rebellion of 1549, just to mention one. The protests did not have the same impact on the population as a whole, where some people benefited from the result more than others. These rich beneficiaries of the protests started to opposing further revolts, ultimately ending up supporting state policies on disciplining the poor. A similar pattern can be seen also in what was to become the Netherlands. For example, in the Peasants' War of 1525, which is depicted in the image on the slide, which would then grow to go beyond the unequal distribution in wealth and to encompass also, for example, people's right to control their own religious life. So far, we have seen how the inequality of rights, wealth, and income is a fundamental trait of early modern history all across Europe. This inequality was determined by legal, social, and political regimes, in which in turn were influenced by protests, rebellions, and by the political agency of the workers and the ideas of the elites. We will now see how industrialization and early globalization impacted these dynamics, influencing the distribution of wealth in modern history. In modern history, thanks to industrialization and early globalization processes, we assist to a steady increase in the living standards and in the disparity of income and wealth. This widening of the wealth and income gap took place across a wide spectrum of social classes at a different pace in each country. In addition, this trend can be seen not only within social classes, but also in geographic areas. For example, the wealth gap between industrial and rural areas, between central and peripheries, between regions within a single country increased as well. In this presentation, we will talk about how inequality came about reactions to inequality, both in practice and in intellectual debates. Economic historians believe that this gap in wealth distribution is a result of the industrialization process in itself. Among economic historians, it is possible to identify specifically two strands of interpretations of what was the impact of the industrialization on income and living standards. We can identify an optimistic and a pessimistic interpretation. To simplify, the optimistic interpretation says that despite wealth being unequally distributed, the living standards for everyone improved, thanks to the increase of wages and the expansion of industrial production across Europe. To sum up, everybody gained from industrialization. The other interpretation, which is, as I said, a little bit more pessimistic, posits that the rise of wages alone is not enough, and that ultimately quality of life did not improve for everyone. Not everyone was better off after industrialization came about. Irrespective of the interpretation and of what they say of the long-term impact of industrialization, however, there is now a general consensus that, in its early stages at least, industrialization made things worse for many people. This is because at the beginning of the process, many parts of the population were left behind. Productivity and profit did increase, but only for the owners of the industries, while workers were kept on living at a subsistence level, so with the bare minimum that was necessary to grant themselves shelter, clothing, and food. In addition, local producer and craftsmen also could not compete with the fast and cheap industrial production, and they also fell under the threshold for poverty. Profits were so unevenly distributed, and population will then divide in three classes. We have the urban poor, we have the middle class, and we have a very limited amount of rich capitalists. This divide became a symbol of the era for many Europeans and is well exemplified in the literature of the time. For example, in the oeuvre of Charles Dickens, an example of which can be seen on the slide, or an illustration of which can be seen on the slide. Reality was unfortunately very, very close to these portrayals. In Bohemia, in Central and Eastern Europe, for example, financial and political elites were the 1% of the population at the beginning and at the end of the century. This did not change, with about 1,000 people, more or less. At the end of the century, however, poor people in the region had increased and were now 3.5 million. In practice, we can see different responses to inequality in this period. The first type that we can identify is mass migration, both from Europe to North America, but also from rural to urban areas. The migration from rural to urban areas was extremely impactful in modern history, with the population in urban centers augmenting sixfold from the beginning to the end of the 19th century. Mass migration can be considered a sort of spontaneous social response to increasing inequality, for people tried to move closer to industrial centers to gain higher wages. But at the same time, migration in itself contributed to the exacerbation of this inequality, because people moving to urban areas were losing their traditional support network, which often remained home. Government reactions to increasing urban poverty, including regulation of housing conditions or poor relief, can also be considered a response to the increasing inequality in wealth distribution, especially in urban areas. Finally, social self-organization increased as well, especially the organization of labor in workers' associations, in trade unions, and in political parties. All these labor associations focus on the promotion of improved working conditions, as well as on the provision of mutual assistance to their members. In addition to this, political parties focused also on the promotion of universal suffrage as a way to have a bigger representation of the needs of the workers within governments. Across the 19th century, we can see several different theories underpinning this practical expression come to the fore. Initially, we have classical economists such as Smith and Malthus, who focused on the relationship between rent, wage, and the fair distribution of profit. So, if you have a good wage and if you don't pay a high or an exorbitant rent, then you would have a good distribution of profit. But they focus purely on the economical dimension of wealth distribution, overlooking the moral and the political dimension. Their successor, John Stuart Mill, underlined the role played by laws and customs in societies onto the distribution of wealth. And this happened in the first half of the 19th century. Around mid-century, German philosopher Karl Marx takes Stuart Mill's argument even further and flips it on its head. And he starts arguing that it isn't laws and customs that influence the distribution of wealth, but the contrary. Customs and values are produced by economic relations. In particular, he theorizes that the profit made by capitalists are built onto the unpaid wage of workers, who are paid a wage that's based on the value of their skills of the market and not on the value of the product that they produce. This Marx claims, so this unpaid wage is the main reason why workers are worse off in industrialized society than they were before industrialization. Finally, toward the end of the century, we can see how classical economists responded to Marx's theory. For example, Vilfredo Pareto, who is an Italian economist, noted how within any given society, it is the small but extremely rich part of the population that controls most of the wealth. And he highlights that this is natural and productive, so that this is endemic to modern economies, and that this ensures the continuous production within the industry. Irrespective of the theory applied or of the practice tried out, when we then arrived to the end of the century, where the levels of income inequality started to significantly decline. We thus jump into contemporary history with a situation that is steadily improving, wealth distribution is slowly becoming more equal, and workers across Europe started mobilizing in trade unions, political parties, and workers' associations. Let us now see what happened in the 20th century. We will look once again at the trends in the distribution of wealth and income, at the intellectual responses to inequality, and finally, at reactions in practice. Here we go. Thanks to the mobilization of labor at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, we can see European countries experiencing reductions in inequality. And this happens thanks to social democratic policies focused on progressive taxation, so on taxing the rich more than they were taxing the poor, and on the introduction of the welfare state. The reduction in inequality will continue until around the 1970s. This trend, so the trend where we see inequality reducing until the 1970s and then actually rising up again after the 1970s, holds true if we look at the European continent as a whole. But when we zoom in on specific countries, we can see considerable differences. I'm going to mention just a few examples. Sweden will actually experience a continued decline in the income gap until the 1980s and not until the 1970s, and with no reversals, even during the First World War or the Great Depression, I'm so sorry. On the other hand, in Spain, inequality remained stable throughout the Francoist regime, with no registered decline. In Eastern Europe, finally, income inequality held until the Second World War, and then the communist regimes contributed to the preservation of low levels of income inequality until the late 80s. So we have a little bit of a translated trend where we have inequality lasting longer, but then the lowering of inequality also lasting longer. After the end of the 1970s, inequality started to rise again on the continent at large. There are several theories as to why is that. Some think it's because of the long-lasting effects on industrialism and capitalism, which in the long run ended up benefiting everyone by increasing the quality of life and the access to services and wages. Others highlight the fact that Europe, between the end of the Second World War and the 1970s, lived a period of relative peace, stability, and prosperity, which would then go on until the end of the century. And in this period, there were little shocks. There were no wars, there were no epidemics, there were small in scale economic crises. And this allowed for the accumulation of income and of wealth for people, and thus for the creation of this disparity of income and wealth again. Finally, something that this is linked to the slow erosion of the welfare state across Europe. So in other presentation made within the Teaching European History in the 21st Century project, speakers have talked about how welfare states started declining and welfare policies started declining after the 70s. And this might also be a reason why inequality started rising again. Before jumping into intellectual debate and into the practice of distributing wealth in contemporary history, I would actually now like to zoom in on the Insular Bloc and on the role of the policies of communist regimes. Here, wealth and income were extremely unevenly distributed up until the Second World War, as mentioned a while ago. After the Yalta Conference and the end of the war, the Eastern European countries started adopting Soviet economic models, which included planned economy and the dictatorship of the proletariat. This resulted in a radical redistribution of wealth. And which was in its own impacted especially by the abolishment of private ownership, which made everyone's income dependent solely on their earnings, and earnings themselves leveled. This redistribution of wealth, however, was not enough to satisfy workers or intellectuals in the time, who were still unsatisfied with the regime. And we can see this in several revolts in the 50s, including revolts in the German Democratic Republic, in Poland, and the revolt in Hungary in 1956. As a result of these revolts and of this growing unsatisfaction, communist parties in many, many countries across Eastern Europe started making several concessions and changes to win over the working class. This included raising the wages, promoting new and affordable housing, promoting free education and free access to healthcare, for example, which in its own contributed to reducing inequality even more by leveling access to these necessities such as education, healthcare, and housing. After the collapse of state socialism in 1989-1990, wealth and income equality started rising quickly in Eastern Europe as well, due to the fact that Eastern European countries found themselves going back to the wider European context, which was characterized by that time by neoliberalism, which we will see a little bit later in this presentation. Looking at Europe as a whole, however, we can say that the trends in income inequality in the 20th century followed a U-shaped curve with an almost steady decline of inequality until the 1970s. We have just two relatively short hiccups, one right before the First World War and one during the Great Depression, and then inequality rising again after the 1970s and until the end of the century. Incidentally, in almost all European countries, we could map the rise and fall of labor movement, seeing it follow a very similar pattern. Earlier in this presentation, we have seen how the communist theories exposed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the Communist Manifesto took hold of the intellectual debates on income and inequality at the end of the 19th century. It does not come as a surprise, then, that the 20th century picks up right from where we have left off. Following the death of Marx, Marxist parties found themselves split into two perspectives on how power could be attained. On the one hand, we have the communist perspective, which was quite suspicious of welfare state policies promoted across Europe and called for the revolution of the proletariat. On the other hand, Social Democrats were quite happy with the welfare state and called for the universal suffrage as a means to bring socialist parties into power and promote more reform. In addition to the communist and to the Social Democrat intellectual responses to inequalities, the concept of moral economy or subsistence ethics was also originated in the 1900s. This concept refers to the fact that local social structures should be designed to respect the subsistence needs, shelter, food, health, and safety of the poor. When these subsistence needs are not met, then poor or peasant communities will protest and rebel against the entity which breached this pact, being it local elites, state authorities, or market forces. When discussing practical reaction to inequality, the first historical event that tried to establish an equal society and abolish social classes in contemporary history was the Russian Revolution of October in 1917, which resulted in the creation of world's first and for a long period of time only socialist country, the Soviet Union. After the revolution, the country found itself with depleted resources and with a fundamentally impoverished society, and a debate arose on how the new ruling party should finance their industrialization. Two views arose specifically. One faction, led by Leon Trotsky, thought that industrialization should be financed with funds coming from the agricultural sphere. The other faction, led by Nikolai Bukharin, recommended to develop agriculture instead. After the death of Lenin, this debate left the economic sphere of how will we finance industrialization of our country to enter the political sphere and became part of the discussion on Lenin's legacy. When Stalin rose to power, he adopted the view that was fostered by Leon Trotsky and adopted a series of policies to nationalize all the land, to finance industrialization, to promote super industrialization, to nationalize the means of production and to abolish private ownership. This did result in an effective reduction of income and wealth inequality. As we saw before, now all income will be connected to salary. At the same time, however, this resulted in the rising of a new type of inequality, which was connected to the privilege of bureaucracy. So bureaucrats in this period, in the Soviet Union and in countries that followed the same economic model, so in Eastern Europe, would have access to privileges that workers in other positions would not have access to. Policy reactions to inequality in Western Europe, on the other hand, focused on the promotion of welfare state policies as a means to reduce inequality. These policies were implemented especially in the early 1900s. And then they saw a halt in the period of the Great Depression and were implemented again after the Second World War. In the 1960s, alongside the development of welfare states, we can also assist in many Western countries to a so-called Marxist Renaissance, which was brought about by youth who started rebelling against consumption and private production and started calling for new reforms that would follow the communist imprint. Both the Marxist Renaissance and the welfare states came to an end in the 70s and in the 80s with a new form of capitalism and of liberalism that started to promote the implementation of projects across the world and the subsequent accumulation of wealth. In this way, and so by means of accumulation of wealth and the implementation of neoliberal projects across the world, the idea was that in this way, neoliberals, no. On the other hand, policy reactions to inequality in Western Europe focused on the promotion of welfare state policies as a means to reduce inequality. These policies were implemented especially in the early 1900s, saw a halt in the period after the Great Repression, and when implemented again after the Second World War. In the 1960s, alongside the development of the welfare state, we can assist in many countries to the rise of a so-called Marxist Renaissance, which was brought about by youth who started rebelling against consumption and private production and calling for reforms that had a Marxist imprint. Both the Marxist Renaissance and the welfare state in itself came to an end in the 1970s and in the 1980s across Europe, with the rise of a new form of capitalism that started to promote the implementation of neoliberal projects across the world and the accumulation of wealth. By implementing this project and accumulating wealth, neoliberals such as Margaret Thatcher in the UK or Ronald Reagan in the United States claimed even the lower classes would gain, and even more than in socialist society. In addition to neoliberal policies, in the 1970s, another practice took hold, that of outsourcing traditional industries to developing countries. As a result of both outsourcing and of the new neoliberal order, as well as, of course, of the sudden end of the Cold War and the collapse of planned economies in Eastern Europe, inequality started rising again, both within Europe, so for example, between regions, between the center and the periphery, but also between what we now call the global north and the global south. The global north being the countries, for example, doing the outsourcing, and the global south being the countries receiving the outsourced work because providing cheap forms of labor. This is the situation that we find ourselves in today. So that's it from me. In this presentation, we looked at the distribution of wealth in early modern history and at the tension between mercantilism before the 1750s and the laissez-faire policy of early industrialization. Then we looked into modern history and into trends of growing inequality, into intellectual debates, and into practical responses to this global equality, including self-organization of labor. And then we looked at contemporary history and at this U-shaped trend of decreasing inequality until the 1970s and then increasing inequalities after that. We looked at the exceptions of the Eastern Bloc. We looked at intellectual debates spurred by the death of Marx, but also at other intellectual theories and into the practical responses to rising inequality, especially into the practical responses in the Eastern Bloc with Sovietization and the abolition of private property, but also at the creation of welfare state policies in Western Europe. I would like to thank you for viewing this presentation, and I would like to warmly recommend that you have a look at chapter 5.2 of the handbook, The European Experience, a multi-perspective history of modern Europe, which will be published soon, for a more in-depth analysis of the distribution of wealth in Europe. We have only barely scratched the surface, and there's so much more in that chapter that I believe will be very useful and interesting for all of you who have viewed this presentation. Thank you.